It really helps if you plug them in or turn them on. Okay, so let's. So I'm going to sit down here, but here's the part of the review sheet. If anybody still didn't get one, there's some up here. I think I've run out of question polls, although they're online. So you've got three separate things that have to do with the design argument. Remember, in that Aquinas PowerPoint, the only one we're interested in is Aquinas' fifth way. That's a version of the design argument. I never do the fourth way. And basically, the other three ways. Oh, I didn't pass around the rolls. Let's see. Okay, this is. Let me recycle. This is a. Well, okay. I keep on forgetting to put one in. I put a new one in Essex. So this is the roll, and okay, section 2 and October 30th. Okay, thanks. Start that around. Okay, so as I said, you have three different things that concern the design argument. You have Aquinas' fifth way, which is a very simple statement of the argument. You have. Now, I think your version of the book has a selection from Paley in it. But even if you don't have the book, there's that selection from Paley that we went over in class that's in supplemental readings in Blackboard. It's only 4 pages. If you look at that to review it, you don't need to get bogged down in Paley's description of the inner workings of the watch, right? I'm not worried about that, but we're worried about the basics of his own argument from analogy and how, and so I'm going to say some about that. But first, Aquinas in the 5 ways. Now, you have to understand that after Newton's physics and after Darwin, most contemporary scientists do not see nature in the way that Aquinas did, and which dates back to the way Aristotle looked at nature. Aristotle looked at nature as imbued with things that serve functions or purposes. Whereas after Newton's physics, and also Darwin, it's been more common to look at nature as just a mechanical system following laws of nature, but not a system where things function for purposes. And we'll say more about that shortly. So Aquinas focuses on this because the Aristotelian view that things in nature just have purposes, and Aristotle thought there was a designer of nature, is also very amenable to the Judeo-Christian view, and I guess Islamic view, that that God creates things in the world to serve different functions or purposes. And this is where Aquinas goes. Now, on the blackboard behind me, there's the word teleological, T-E-L-E-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L. The teleological argument is just another name for the design argument, and it gets its name from the Greek word telos, which is a function or purpose. So the design argument starts off with the observation that things that are designed by human beings are designed and built to fulfill various functions or purposes. There's a bunch of them right here on my desk, right? This glasses case didn't get here by accident. It was designed to fulfill the function, as well as this little combination flashlight. Right. I mean, and so this is what Aquinas functions on. Why cannot things in nature direct themselves toward a goal? Well, or purpose. In other words, he says there are things in nature that fulfill purposes or goals, but without intelligence, lacking understanding or intelligence, he says they can't direct themselves toward that goal. What do you need? Well, he gives the example of an archer shooting an arrow toward the goal of the bullseye on the target. And he says, well, you need an intelligence to direct something toward a goal. And so, why do things in nature need to direct them toward that end? Because an intelligence is needed. Obviously, who fulfills that need for Aquinas is the God of Bible and church tradition, the God of monotheism. That, for Aquinas, is the author of nature and the God who created things in nature such that they fulfill goals or purposes. Now, Paley is a theologian, I imagine, in the Church of England. And so his argument is basically the same argument. You remember, and again, the Paley selection, if you don't have your book, is also in supplementary readings. Paley says he's walking through a field, a heath. He comes across a stone. He doesn't think anything of it. He says, look, my thought about the stone would be, for all I know, the thing could have lain there forever. It is produced by entirely natural forces, and I don't have any problem thinking that. And I said, think about walking across some of the older field areas, grassy areas of campus, not the new ones where there's, not a twig out of place in the quad, but the older grassy areas, right? You find some broken twigs on the ground. I'll put the roll up here that you decided on the way out. Right, you find some leaves on the ground. You find some pebbles, little stones. No problem in thinking, well, these got here by purely natural forces. It needs no explanation beyond that. But if you found a ballpoint pen, laying in the middle of the field, like that somebody dropped, you would not say, well, isn't that interesting? Besides, rocks and leaves and stuff, the forces of nature have worked together here to to make a ballpoint pen and put it here. No, that's not what you would conclude. So Paley says, look, the answer I gave, he says, what if I found a watch in the field? He says, I would not give the same answer for the watch as I gave for the stone, that for all I knew, it might have been sitting there forever and might have been produced totally by the forces of nature. He says, why wouldn't I give the same answer for the watch as the stone? He says, for this reason and no other, that when I look at the watch, I find what I did not find in the stone, that it has intricate parts that work together to enable it to fulfill a function or purpose. So here's the telos in the teleological argument. The argument, pretty much everybody thinks it's an argument from analogy. I think it is. I saw somebody on the internet trying to argue the opposite, but I couldn't make hide nor hair of their reasons why they thought it was not an analogy. In an argument from analogy, you compare two things. You say they have similar characteristics. And then you say, well, if they're similar in some ways, might they be similar in an additional way? And there's where your conclusion lies. So Paley says, look, here I have the watch that has a series of intricate things. Now, in that selection you've got in supplementary readings, I go on to quote, and by the way, I do, but your author did not in his selection of Paley. I go into the later chapter where Paley drives home the analogy. Paley says, look, we can make the same points about things in nature. And he focuses on the eye. And he says, look, an eye is like the watch in that it has parts that intricately work together to enable it to serve a purpose. And he says, okay, the watch and the eye are similar in those respects, so how do we get to the conclusion? Well, namely that the watch didn't just get there by natural forces. It needed a designer and builder to design it and build it so that those parts work together to fulfill that purpose. And Paley says, well, if the eye has the same similarities, why wouldn't the eye need a designer and builder also? And who would the designer and builder of the eye be other than God himself? So there's the analogy. Now, David Hume criticizes the analogy. He thinks it's a weak analogy. Here again, I'm going to let you weigh in on this if you write on it. And this is also, by the way, a possible term paper topic. And there's nothing wrong in extending a test essay into a 5 or 6 page term paper. It happens all the time, folks, at the graduate level, where somebody writes a paper for a class and they end up extending it into a 70-page thesis for their master's degree or something, you know. I once met Ray Moody. Anybody know who Raymond Moody is? He wrote books like Life After Life, where he talks about whether there's any evidence for life after death from near-death, things like near-death experiences. And he's a credible person. He has a PhD in philosophy, but he also has, he's a doctor. He's a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist first has to be a medical doctor, then they go on to specialize in psychiatry. And so he's a very credible guy, but his dissertation started out as a graduate seminar paper in one of my graduate instructors' classes at the University of Virginia. So nothing wrong in extending something that was a test essay into your term paper if you like working on this. Back to the design argument. Now, if you look at the slides on Hume on the design argument, somebody asked me, but I mean, the first thing, St. Thomas, you've got a separate PowerPoint, right, on St. Thomas and also the ontological argument on the same PowerPoint. You have a separate PowerPoint on Hume on the design argument and the problem of evil. We didn't look at the problem of evil, or did we? I don't think we did. No, not in our class. I did over at Essex. Then we have a separate PowerPoint on Descartes' Meditations and a separate PowerPoint on British empiricism for John Locke and George Berkeley. And remember, there are integrity files on all of these. And I did record the review I did where I went over your essay questions last time. That's in there too. Anyway, to go back to this, Damia doesn't like the design argument because he wants to see something that's airtight mathematically, like the ontological argument. That's not Hume's quibble with the design argument. Damia doesn't like it that it's only a probable argument. In other words, an argument from analogy is a type of inductive argument. In deductive arguments like the ontological argument, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. You'd reach a contradiction assuming the premises are true and the conclusion false. And we saw that with the ontological argument, right, on the last test. In a probabilistic argument, and I illustrated like pulling 99 balls out of a box, even if you pulled 99 marbles and they all were black, and there are 100 of them in there, you have a very strong inductive argument to conclude that they're all black marbles. However, it's still possible that the last one, even though it's improbable, that the last one you pull out of there is some other color, that it's white or green or red or something. In even a strong inductive argument, it does not allow you to draw the conclusion with 100% certainty. It's always probable. And Damia doesn't like this. Hume says there's nothing wrong with probable arguments as long as you're comparing apples with apples and oranges with oranges. What he does not like about the design argument is he says it's a weak analogy because you're not comparing similar things. He says you're comparing very unlike things if you're comparing the universe as a whole to an item that's designed and built by human beings like a house or a ship or Paley's watch. And so Hume describes, so I talk about analogies, that you're saying things are alike in certain respects, therefore, as your conclusion, they must be alike in a further respect. In other words, you're saying the watch and the eye are alike in having parts that work together to fulfill a purpose, therefore, they must be alike in the further respect of needing a designer. So, what we're supposed to conclude from the design argument? Well, Cleanthes reviews the argument, and it may seem like it's a different argument, but he says the whole universe is like a clockwork mechanism. This is the clockwork universe. And different parts of the universe work together intricately. And also, so he says the universe itself is like a big machine, and it's made of a myriad of other smaller machines, which are the parts of things, like parts of animals and plants. And he says within the universe, things are adjusted toward purposes or ends in ways that seem to imply design. And so the conclusion of the design argument is not just that God exists, but that God has an intelligence similar to human intelligence, although it's much greater because the works of nature are much more intricate than anything that we build. So that's, what makes an analogy weak or strong for Hume is the similarity of the things you're comparing. He says if you're comparing very similar things, like the way blood circulates in one human being to another, the way rocks fall by gravity if they're dropped, or you're comparing very similar things, right? When I take out the second match from the Book of Matches, I expect it to do the same thing the first match did when I strike it on the striker, namely light. Why? Because I'm comparing very similar things. All those matches in that Book of Matches are pretty much the same. Like, so what Hume says is you depart from the similarity of the things you're comparing, and the argument gets weaker and weaker and weaker. It's like trying to draw one ball or only 5 or 10 out, or marbles, and you see that they're black, and you conclude that all 100 of them are black. You're weak. And you'll see in the slides, Hume says, if you're trying to compare two things that aren't very alike at all, like corn stalks or trees and the way sap flows in vegetables, and you're trying to make an analogy between that and circulation of blood in human beings, he says you might be led to a completely false conclusion. First of all, when things are very unlike, there's not very much evidence. The evidence in the argument for the conclusion is diminished considerably, but also you might be led to a false conclusion. Now, is Hume concerned about vegetables and trees? No. His point is, we may be, if the universe isn't like a designed object, like a ship or a house, we may be led to the false conclusion that the universe needed a designer. Hume's a skeptic, right? He doesn't think there was a designer there. And so that's why he says a bad argument from analogy is not only a weak argument in terms of the evidence it provides, but it might lead us to a totally false conclusion. he's suggesting that the design argument may lead us to the false conclusion that there's a designer of nature. This thing. I'm bringing it up again because basically it's in the background in the recording. Okay. So Philo doesn't mind arguments from analogy. So in the design arguments analogy, to what is the building of a house compared? Well, basically to the creation of the universe. And Hume says, first of all, we only have one example of a universe. It's not like we've seen, okay, here's universe 1, and that universe needed a designer, and there's universe 2, and I observed that that universe needed a designer, and there's universe 3, 5 to 10, and all those universes needed a designer, so our universe must have needed a designer. Hume says we only have one example of a universe, this universe, and so he says we don't have multiple examples to reason that they had the same cause. Plus, so he says it's wrong to compare the universe to a designed object. What about order? Hume and Darwin both say we do have order in nature. But here's, does order imply design? Well, he says you'd have evidence for it only if you had observed that a particular type of order needed a designer. But where Hume is going with this is he speculates on a naturalistic explanation for order. That is, an explanation for order that brings into play nothing but natural forces. And he says, well, that the order in the universe is a result of design is only one possible conclusion. He says we could just as easily conclude that the order in the universe might come about by some entirely natural principle in matter. Now, Hume is a non-scientist, so he speculates about forces in his own time that lead toward order. Heat and cold, magnetism, stuff that somebody in the late 17th century would know are forces in nature. And I gave the example, right? When you make rock candy, the end product, what you get is a structure where there are crystals that are so regular that look like they were cut by a jeweler, right? When a jeweler cuts a diamond, you know, he designs what the pattern, or she designs what the pattern is going to be, and they intricately cut it. And here you have these crystals that look like they're the product of design, but instead they're the product of natural forces, right? It's the laws of nature that make that sugar, when the water cools, form into those crystals. Now, of course, for somebody in the Judeo-Christian mold, they would say, well, okay, but who made nature such that those laws apply, you know? And of course they would say, well, it's God who designed nature to have those laws. Think about it. Anybody ever go skating on a pond? Not too many people do that, you know. But you know, if ice forms on a pond or a lake, or it's on the top. most of the time solids are heavier than liquids. They're more dense. The crystalline structure of ice is such that the solid form of ice, hardened water, is lighter than the liquid form. Now you could say, well, isn't that just a nice happy accident of nature? Because what would happen otherwise? Suppose ice when it formed was heavier than water. You have a cold winter, right? The ice would form on top and boom! It would take everything in the pond with it, right? Everything would be buried under the ice. But that doesn't happen, you know. And this is part of the fine-tuning argument. I mean, you know, intelligent design advocates would say, well, is that just by accident? Or was it designed that way? Okay, back to this, though. If you have order, Hume says that design is only one of many causes of order, and he says there might be a principle in nature. Now, Hume speculates about this. Paley read Hume. In that selection, if you look, Paley has a comment, I think in his fifth reply to possible objections, where he says, okay, you can say there's some internal principle in nature that causes things to work for a purpose. Paley says, I don't know what we even mean by that internal principle in nature. And he criticizes Hume without using Hume's name. But where Darwin comes in is he tries to fill in the blank as to what, and he says, well, look, over time, over millions of years, you can have a complex eye like our eye develop through completely random natural forces. That what happens is species develop advantageous variations. Some species over time develop better eyes in adaptation to their environment, and that gave them a leg up in the constant struggle, the evolutionary struggle, the survival of the fittest. They were fitter than others, and so you get organisms with more and more complex eyes until finally you get us with our eyes. I mean, that's Darwin's story, right? And I told you, you know, you can tell a pretty good story about how evolution is an entirely naturalistic process if you start out with organisms that are already complex enough to adapt to their environment and develop advantageous variations. You know, I told you, dating back to a book I read when I was in high school, my problem comes way before that. It's my problem with evolution is an undirected natural process, random process. Comes from a book I read by Lecomte de Noy called Human Destiny, where he shows how improbable it is that even one strand of DNA can develop by entirely naturalistic processes, you know. My problem is, how do you even get the first strand of DNA? You know. So, but let me remind you, whether you're right on this or any other question, I never grade your essays on whether or not you're taking a position I happen to agree with. You know, I try to be totally objective about that. And by the way, you know, so some folks gave me drafts and I commented on some. If somebody wants to kick out a draft, it doesn't even have to be a complete essay. and say, well, make some suggestions for improvement. I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to do that over the weekend, as I get online, so. And again, for folks who walked in late, you missed the news that the test has been postponed to Wednesday because I was convinced by a dozen young budding lawyers in my 10 o'clock class. They argued the case. Okay, so everybody has to take the test on the same day. So everything's due on Wednesday now. Okay, and okay. So back to this. I don't know why my phone keeps on wanting to go to the camera.
Just somebody wanting to take a picture of you.
I've had this thing. I've only had this for a few months, and I still don't understand. Although there are some things I like better. I like the LG better than the Galaxy that I had before. Now this is a pretty cheap version. Y'all have better phones than I have, So that's why I'm saying I need to start confiscating some of these phones when I see them out so that I can upgrade my phone, right? Now you guys know I wouldn't really do that, right? But most of you got better phones than I do, anyway. Okay, back to Philo and Cleanthes and all this. To go back to some of the questions, so Philo says other possible causes of order than design, and he says even if we were to conclude that the universe had a designer, there's all kinds of possibilities. He says other than what Paley and Cleanthes and Aquinas want us to conclude, that the designer and maker of the universe is the God of the Judeo-Christian, I guess, Islamic tradition, right? Hume says, well, from the same premises, we could conclude that the designer of the universe was some inept lesser God who was just trying to make a world, made this imperfect world like somebody taking a pottery class and discarded it and moved on, said, oh man, I really messed that one up. Now, it isn't that Hume himself really thinks that that's the case, but he's making a logical point. He says, well, we could have that conclusion. Or he says, we can't even conclude that the universe had only one designer. He says things like houses and ships are built by many people working, together. Why couldn't there be a group of guys that made this world? Again, it's not that Hume himself is a polytheist, but he's trying to say that there's more than one conclusion that's possible besides the one everyone wants to draw. So you're not totally justified in drawing the conclusion that you want to from the design argument. But again, for somebody like Paley or Aquinas, there's only one real option, so Hume says the design argument doesn't even enable us to conclude that the universe had one designer, much less who that designer might be. So, and Philo thinks that it doesn't necessarily show that the deity has human qualities like Cleanthes once. Philo says then that we can conclude only that the universe arose from something like design, some force. But he says everything else, if you're going to make the design argument, see, here I think he makes a legitimate point against somebody like Cleanthes, who's portrayed as an intellectual believer who doesn't like Damia, who's a kind of fundamentalist believer, who doesn't want to base his faith on things like miracles or something, but he wants these rational arguments to be the basis of his faith, like the design argument. But Hume says if we want to make them stand on all fours, there's a problem with that, because more than one conclusion is possible. Now, for a theologian like Aquinas, these arguments are kind of icing on the cake. It's nice that they're there. The Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas' book of theology, is that thick, folks. His 5 ways account for about 2 or 3 pages of that, right? You know, so they're just icing on the cake. But for somebody like Cleanthes, who wants to rest most of his theology on the design argument, Hume is trouble for him. Well, okay. So, any other question? So the design. Next time, I think it's been a while since we went over Descartes. So I'll do some more review next time. You know, since we're not going to do the test Monday, I may go into something new. I may do a little bit of Hume new stuff, but I don't know. I'm going to try to at least review Descartes. So again, make sure that Wednesday you come with your essay, since it's now due Wednesday instead of Monday, and also make sure you have a Scantron for it. Bring a number 2 pencil, although I will have some there. So, okay, sign the roll on the way out if you missed it, and we'll see you. Have a great weekend, folks, and have fun on Halloween and be safe.